Martin, welcome to Life Worlds and to the show. It is such a pleasure to have you here. I'm incredibly excited for this conversation.
Well, thanks. Glad to be here.
As I was just saying before you arrived, I've been absolutely enjoying your book, The Internet of Animals, and another photo book that you gave me when we met a few years ago in Berlin in the Interspecies Conference, which was also related to ICARUS, the project we'll talk about today. Something that really strikes me from everything I've been reading is that you've lived such a rich and unconventional life. I mean, your book reads like a spy or adventure novel. It's like such a page turner. It's like, are they going to get into space? What's happening? The agents, and you find yourself in these like space launch sites in the middle of Kazakhstan, or like swimming in the ocean with sharks, like trying to looking at this one oven bird that's landed. Or like flying airplanes to track these individual like songbirds across the states. And this is all sort of in a pursuit, right, of giving animals a voice in this planet using some of the latest technologies. And in the introduction to the show, I'll have given people quite a thorough background of ICARUS and all that, so that in this conversation we can dig into some of the nuances. So I actually want to start by asking you, like, where do you find the perseverance, right, over 20 years to finally launch a project with all of its twists and turns and setbacks and serendipities, and all the people who say that things can't be done? Like, why have you done all of this, and why did you persevere?
Well, you could also call this pretty stupid and stubborn. So it depends how you want to see it. But I think it's really, whenever I think about the animals, there are so many animals out there that can't voice their concerns about what's happening on the planet, and we have now means to do that. We have ways to, in a way, start to translate their needs, and it's good for us and it's good for the animals. And I think that joint benefit is something that just keeps all of us going in this field.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that. I've worked with a lot of ecologists. There is something quite unique, though, about this vision that you seem to have about how the world can be. And I also felt it a lot at the end of your book, which is like, you almost speak to the inevitability, like, this will happen. We will have a parliament of animals. We will have the internet of animals. It's like, it's astounding that you have this vision. And I love this vision that you set out in the book, where you said, we are coming to the interspecies age, where we will be considering other living species when we make decisions. We are going to become partners and allow wild animals to become a part of our daily lives and allow them to be our teachers, which is just so inspiring and beautiful. And it's a big part, obviously, of this podcast, Life Worlds, and the things we discuss. So I want to get into the realm of how this measurement's been made possible. But first, you write in your book that animals know a lot about the planet that we do not. And you've called them, in some cases, the most intelligent sensors that exist, the most intelligent sensors. Can you share with us some of the most significant findings or discoveries that ICARUS has contributed to since its inception?
Well, I think there are so many examples where we all intuitively know about this. If you have a dog, a cat, or a canary, then you know that these animals know things that you don't, and they watch you all the time. That's all they have to do every day. So also, if they pretend not to watch you, they still listen to you and smell you, and they watch you. I've seen that with our cat and with dogs and everything, and also with like sea lions all around the world. So I think the key component that is added to that also through ICARUS is that they are constantly communicating among each other. And in the old days, the sixth sense of animals was deemed something metaphysical or crazy or anecdotal. And now we know interacting sensors, especially if they are intelligent, they create an emergent novel sensing system. And this is what the animals tap into, what they have constantly running in the background. It's this, the sixth sense is constantly sort of there. And we can read them out through individual animals, what they know about the environment. I mean, it starts with their predictions of earthquakes. It seems to work, still at the very early phase of really understanding that, but there seemed to be something real behind it, or volcanic eruptions. We can also see that in how animals predict future harvests, for example. A very simple system. Gulf of Mexico, the seabirds in April predict the anchovy harvest in October because they are out there eating the small fish larvae, and they decide how to schedule their reproduction depending on how much food is out there. But for us, it sounds magical that an animal in April knows how the harvest will be in October. But it's very simple. We just have to read out the animals. We have to listen to them, and understand their connectiveness. And for the connectivity of these animals around the world, one of the best examples, I think, are the cuckoos. So cuckoos are known to many people. They come in spring, and they sometimes are annoying because they constantly do the cuckoo in your yard, which is actually a good sign because cuckoos are the perfect ambassadors for a biodiversity intact area. So if you have a cuckoo in your yard, you know everything else is good. But our cuckoos do a short distance migration to Angola, to southwestern Africa. Now, if you go to Moscow, they go to the same area. Then we went to our colleagues in Mongolia, and even those cuckoos, at least half of them, go to Angola. The other half actually goes to Australia or Indonesia. And those kind of connections, when you have, and even going out to Kamchatka, almost to Alaska, those cuckoos go down to China, they go across the Himalayas, they go into Africa and meet the European cuckoos. All of them meet down in Angola. So you know that there is this, this common knowledge of an environment that these cuckoos exchange in Angola about environments from Spain to Kamchatka. And understanding that, I mean, really, just appreciating how much these animals know and what you can know if you listen to them. I think it's totally amazing.
Yeah, I remember in the book you have the example of the songbirds and how we used to think that they were flying by genes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the same, I think, for many species. I remember reading Karen Backer's book, and we thought that turtles just hatched,
Mm-hmm.
and actually now being able to listen in.
Mm-hmm.
You and your colleagues, you found that they're communicating in real time, like distances where they're going, and there's this whole
Mm-hmm.
sort of like communication network in the sky,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that, like, in some of these other examples of species communication, like the mother turtles out in the water communicating, the little guys in the eggs are communicating to each other before they hatch, or the coral larvae is using sound to. And so I think that it puts us in our right place, that these aren't just like genetic pre-pattern, just like mechanistic responses, but the world is like this incredibly sentient, like responsive being. And also a really cool example from your book were these we thought that they were what are they called, snakes, right, on the temples of the Incas. I was like, oh, the great snake.
Yeah.
And you guys actually found that they were worms, and I think this was also an interesting finding in terms of forecasting. No?
Yeah, it's intertidal worms. They are super good in forecasting the conditions a few months later.
Yeah.
Which is really exciting because, I mean, obviously the archaeologists got it wrong. They thought they are double-headed snakes and really dangerous and wild animals. No, they're little worms, which are much more important.
Well, and I think that just shows how much wisdom our ancestors had, that they would revere a worm, right? Because they understand that actually that, in the trophic,
Yes.
cascade of life, the worms are just as important. Another really cool finding that I remembered reading was about the sort of different seed dispersal mechanisms of a forest. And you guys found that certain species were actually really key in spreading the forest ecology much, much further and more widely than was known before.
Yeah, and that has advanced a lot. So it's really now called nature-based solutions, that you can really employ animals to spread seeds and really basically get carbon credits for entire landscapes. We now know that animals retain roughly about 6 gigatons of carbon every year. So they are super important climate agents if you let them do their thing. That can be, for example, a muskox in the Arctic that grazes down a bush, and that changes the albedo, which means that the nights will be colder because the heat is not retained. And that means the permafrost will not thaw, and that will keep the carbon at bay and also the nitrogen. And that is a massive effect, and the reef fish are really important in that as well. So I mean, there are so many of those effects that we can sort of jointly use, the animals and humans, and it creates benefits that are beyond anything that we are seeing now. You mentioned the seed dispersal fruit bats, for example, in Africa, the large straw-colored fruit bats. They probably plant roughly 100 million trees every night. Not all of them germinate, but it's a lot. And especially in areas where people have deforested, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Burkina Faso, in Niger. And that's areas where people are getting in conflict because there's no natural resource left for people if animals don't plant them. And that then means that people are fighting, they're emigrating, they're going other places. And all of that is something that destroys the natural livelihood in these areas. And by protecting animals, we can work against that.
Something that you're mentioning there is really key because often ecology or science has like operated in its silo, and you're pointing to this obvious interdependency between human systems and ecological systems and how we need to work on them kind of in a holistic approach. How has some of the research that you guys have been doing over the last decades, because you're obviously inside of quite an esteemed institution, right? The Max Planck Institute. And then you're obviously parts of networks of sort of higher education institutions. So how have your findings changed the Institute's stance towards, let's say, things like animal behaviors or climate? And how are you influencing the work of maybe even other like disciplines and fields of study?
Well, I think there are various ways how that is changing. For one, and that's the ICARUS initiative, is a global bottom-up collaboration of people who are in that field. And in the old days, I think all the ecologists did their thing locally, and every result was in a way right because you couldn't ever confirm it because it was sort of everybody did their thing. But now, with the global reach of all of those data, and people are getting more and more interested in bringing their data together on a global scale, especially the young people, then you can do analyses that you couldn't do before. And those are the really exciting ones. And I think that also changes how this entire discipline is being viewed, because we are not doing idiosyncratic, just sort of locally applicable analyses. We're doing global stuff, and this has to be right because you can really test it. It's almost like a weather forecast. If you say it's raining tomorrow and it's sunny, then you're wrong, and that's how ecology was in the old days. But now we can make predictions, and we prove ourselves right or wrong, and that's really important. So we're working against the real thing, although we still do basic science.
Is it changing the way that people around you, maybe inside of academia or otherwise, are thinking about our relationship to animals? Because obviously a big part of your thesis is let's give animals a voice, let's kind of see them as partners. How do you imagine that could influence the ways that we do many things, many other kinds of work and study?
It is changing, but it's changing very slowly because big academic institutions, but in general, academia is a very slow changing dinosaur. But it is changing, especially what you mentioned about the culture, for example, in animals, migration culture in songbirds. When I went into academic research, whatever, 30 years ago, it was clear that the genes determine everything. You're a little machinery that is bound by your history but your family and your population history, where you come from. And that's completely changed now. We now know that animals have culture, and it changes all the time. They also have fashion. And that makes so many things much more easy to understand, but it also makes some of these things that have even gotten into our language so makes it so obviously stupid when, for example, you listen to a soccer game and somebody says, oh, obviously it is in the DNA of this the Bavaria Munich, for example, that they play this and this way, and you think, well, how stupid is that? I mean, why did we accept this over the last 200 years, that we are this automata, these predetermined things that don't have their own will and their own culture? We can change from one day to the next, and I think that's one part. And I think the other part is that we are confirming more and more that the fundamental law of ecology or life in general is that diversity begets productivity. So the more diverse a system is, the more productive it is in the long term. And that is also very important for states and cultures and discussions about immigration or not, invasion or not. So I think these two things, that we can change rapidly, and that diversity is the most important thing to embrace, is something that we are learning as the fundamental laws of ecology.
Yeah, I'm excited a little bit later in our conversation to get into like diversity of even democratic processes. Like something that we've been tracking a long time is, how do we give other beings a voice inside of interspecies councils or inside of governance? And I think, how is it different if you have a seat for nature at the table? And that's, bringing in diversity of I think one of the largest stakeholders that's been absent, which is this entity we call nature, which is obviously what we are. In terms of the science, right? So the Internet of Animals, if I understand it well, and I'll pull from a paper that you sent me before we spoke, your definition of the Internet of Animals is it sort of encompasses all types of animal data, the linkages between these databases, and then an automated analysis. And you speak about these four major innovations, right? The first is that the amount of data is growing exponentially. The second is that the variety and the velocity of live data streams is increasing with things like, you just mentioned like citizen science, iNaturalist, birds, etc., eBird. Then there's formal linkages between these data sets. And then obviously we can now apply AI and sort of like these large language learning models for both collecting that data and the analysis. So I would love for you to bring us into some of the latest like scientific discoveries and advances that make this possible. Like, how does it look behind the scenes? How does it all fit together? Like, maybe you can make the technology come alive for people who aren't, strapping sensors to animals all day long.
Yeah. Well, let's just go to Africa, savannas, and there we have a big problem that people are hunting rhinos for their horns. They kill them in many cases. So what can you do? But at the same time, what is the science behind what we can understand there? So let's go to Kruger National Park, one of the biggest national parks in Southern Africa. And there the question is, there are a lot of people working on preserving these animals, but there's also a lot of mafia structure, and sort of people are buying information or paying people to give information or not go to certain places or whatever. So those kind of mafia structures. Now, what can you do? You can ask animals how they see their world. And how you do that is you produce tiny little ear tags that you give these animals. The poachers or tourists or whoever doesn't know that they have these tags don't even see them. So in a giraffe, for example, they have tiny little black spots in the ear, and we put our tags on top of that, so it looks as if it's just a black spot in the ear. And the giraffes are watching the savanna. And when they get nervous, and that's what you get from these little tags, they are solar powered, they're constantly measuring the acceleration, so the speed of movement of the ears. And when the giraffe ears do some weird things, then you know, oh, something's wrong here. And if several in a group do that, then you know, oh, they even look in a certain direction, so you know where the problem lies. But then over there you have zebras that do the same thing, or lions that get stunned by somebody walking through, apparently. And that means you have a poacher walking through an area, and you can even determine where that is by the reaction of these animals, by how they wiggle their ears, how they look at things in their world. And then you can alert, because that's real-time information. We use the Internet of Things, to which usually connects the dishwashers with your window or the car, but it now connects the animals in real time. And that means we have real-time information anywhere in the world of what is happening in this area of Southern Africa. And we can alert the rangers through systems that, like Earth Ranger, so the systems that are operational awareness systems set up for parks, which is really exciting because it means that we get information on how these animals communicate, what they see, but we can also use that information to alert people about problems. And all is being done by minute technical devices that are sort of like little cell phones in the ears, in ear tags of these animals.
I mean, first of all, it's such a beautiful example. And I'm just so grateful that, people like you and your teams are doing this in the world. Like, honestly, thank you. You make it sound simple, like, oh, you put an air tag and then it sends the thing. But actually, after reading your book, it's like those little air tags and those technologies are astounding. And actually, like, maybe we can go a level deeper. Like, what is so cool about these little air tags? And also, my understanding is like they're sending their information to space and then that's being sent back down. And so you need to sort of triangulate, if that's the right word. Sorry, I'm not very technical, obviously, between like the signal that's being sent, some satellite in the sky, in enough time then for some computer. So what's that wider system that it's connected to? And obviously you guys wanted it to be on the International Space Station, and now you're going to do it through these cubes that we can talk about later. But like, what's actually happening? Because even like having the right satellite in space to pick up something that's like being given off a giraffe's ear, and you're doing this with hundreds of animals around the world. Like, what's that whole system about?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, since we gave up on the ISS, the International Space Station System, because of the war, we don't have a satellite connection at the moment. So we only do it locally in these large scale areas where we have local connectivity, like a national park, Kruger Park, or so. We build our own local connection systems. These tags communicate over 100 or 180 kilometers. Even a little ear tag. But as of now, they don't communicate with satellite because we are just about to launch the next CubeSat fleet. And
but
then
when it goes up with a satellite, do you have to wait for the satellite to be overhead? Or like, how does that even...
Yes, in that case, yes. But with a satellite fleet, we're planning 6 satellites initially. That gives us about a 10 to 20 minute response time. So that's actually not really bad. In many situations, you can also buffer that in between with a system that maybe sends some of the data terrestrially. So it depends how urgent the need is for certain information. You can always make intermediate systems, except in the oceans, you need the satellite. But there you usually don't have a need for an absolute immediate communication system. So within 20 minutes or so, half an hour is fine, usually.
And my understanding is, obviously, as you were getting this whole system up and running over, more than 2 decades, it's not just technical issues, but it's like administrative. Like, how do you send an antenna into space and work across many different agencies? And then you had this amazing chapter, a series of anecdotes in your book about like these like wearables for wildlife, and like an Oura or a Fitbit for the wildlife, and how you actually design them and how you can tag an animal without bothering it. Can you tell us a little bit about like some of the stories of like, I love the ones about like, like the harnesses for blackbirds, or like how do you design wearables for animals?
Yeah, thankfully there's a big community globally among the ecologists that do that, and there's some good exchange. There's more exchange happening, so we learn from each other's mistakes. But yeah, I mean, we had years and years, and now I think it's 10 years of testing the best wearables for blackbirds in aviaries. They have to reproduce, they have to live with it, it shouldn't hurt them in any way. So there was a lot of development. The same for ear tags. For example, we thought, oh, a rhino, in Europe or in German, they are called the thick-skinned animals, the thick skins. And you think, well, a huge ear, no problem to put a 30, 40 gram ear tag in. Nope, doesn't work. They have the most delicate ears, although they're really big and thick.
Wow.
So if the ear tag is more than about 15 grams, then it slowly moves out. It doesn't hurt the animal, but it moves out. So we had to make the solar ear tag and the whole system below 15 grams. And now it works beautifully, but that took us about 5 years of development in many trials and many defeats. So you put an ear tag in and the rhino claps it or slaps it a little bit. They make up to 10 G, so 10 times Earth acceleration with their ears. So really amazing. They can move their ears like nobody else. They can slap them. They can obviously slap flies and insects, but they can also make sound with that when they slap their ears. So pretty amazing what you learn about ears of animals, or in general, systems of how animals can and want to carry a tag. A stork, for example, we now have electronic leg bands, and that works beautifully because you don't have to catch an adult animal, which is always a stress and always a trauma. But you go to the nest, they are fine with that, at least in white storks. You put a leg band on them and they have it for lifetime. So that's super easy. And that's also something we are now doing with orangutans. We're trying, or other great apes, just shoot some nettles onto them so that they stick in the fur for a few days maybe. But during that time, they collect highest definition data and then they fall off, and that's fine. So the animal doesn't even recognize it had a tag. In deer, for example, we have worked with a group here to create a system where they go to a salt lick. So there's a little stone, salt stone, in a little box. They put their head in. The system checks whether the animal is tagged, and if not, it gets a little necklace tag. Works beautifully. The animals are startled for a second, then they look and go back into licking on the stone. So it's a system where we get rid of this problem of really influencing animals while we tag them.
I love that there's like every day on Earth, like people who are waking up and thinking about like the life worlds of these animals and like how is it that they live and how can we tag them, and you're thinking about like extreme heat, extreme cold, but also, I mean, you spoke about fashion just now. It's like, I was struck by this part of your book where you say like, would the wearable make the bird more or less attractive for copulation, like for it's like mating partners. Like you really have to put yourself in the hoofs or the claws of like the animal to figure out like how you design these things for them not to affect their lives too much. Yeah, it's so cool.
Or the other way around, make it so attractive that they want to actually have it. And that seemed to be in the early days of baboon research. A friend told me that they put these at that time collar tags on the baboons, just on the silverback males. And when they woke up from anesthesia, the little ones came and tried to, so their kids and the kids in the group, and tried to fiddle around with the tag. And they just stood there and looked at everybody and sort of indicated, well, this is now what a silverback has. This is the new fashion. Don't even look at it. So this is taboo. And this is sort of, this is now the sign of the silverback. So
I love that. Wow. I'm curious, what are some things that you've like wanted to track or observe? You probably have a long list, or maybe you don't, and that you haven't been able to for whatever reasons, limitations of animals, technologies, things that you intuit are important in your research. What would things like that be?
For me, it's actually the barn swallows have always been the most interesting ones, because I grew up on or close to a farm. My grandfather had a farm, and there were always barn swallows, and also our house always had house martins. And I always wanted to know where they go and how far they go, but they are really small. So you need a 1 gram tag, and that's what we have now. So at least within Europe, where we have a good Internet of Things network, we are starting to work with these animals and really understand, also swifts. Are they riding the cold fronts into, say, from Germany to Spain when there's a really cold spill and then come back a week later? What are the swallows doing during their time in Europe before they go into Africa, and are they coming back? So it's actually a question that has been around for about 300 years. That why are barn swallows? Why do they have really variable populations? Why swifts in certain cities always have a certain number of pairs that are there? So how is stability and variability in populations regulated? And we don't know yet, because we can't track these animals. We don't know. I mean, for the 15,000 storks in Germany that go to the south in fall, about 10 to 12,000 die every year. But where, when, why? Nobody knows. Or the 5 billion songbirds that go from Europe to Africa, about 2.5 billion die every year. Does anybody know where and why and how? No. So it's absolutely stunning if you think about that. And that's only one side of the coin, where they die, but we mostly want to know where they live well, because that's, sort of both sides of the coin. You want to know to protect them.
Yeah, what strikes me is, as we will get into a world of increasing climate instability, unpredictability, your work might get harder because, the currents are changing in ways that we can't predict, and animals themselves are quite lost. Places where they wanted, places where they've been habituated to rest and to between their and to roost during their migrations are gone. And so it's going to be very interesting to track these populations, not only in general, but during a time of such disruption. And then how will you feed that information into the other large climate data models and actually make sense of it all?
Yeah. For us, it's really exciting, because it's almost like a global natural experiment. If we see humans as part of nature, then it's a natural experiment. And obviously we are changing a lot during the Anthropocene. But for us, even the COVID times, I think, alerted us to the fact that we can now really observe on a global scale what humans do to animals, how they influence animals. And that, I think, triggered this idea that we are part of this natural system. We can study it, we can observe it, but we can also use the information that we get from that to make everything better for animals and humans. So exactly as you said, that we are starting to feed our data into established data streams. For example, now we just got a grant to work with the German Weather Service, that they really use animal data and also real-time animal data to feed into their weather models and climate models, and make also the retrospective weather analysis much better through that. And that's exciting, because that's the first time that terrestrial animals are really being used for that. Marine animals are already being used in terms of, their data are being used. They are employed by the NOAA, so the North American Atmospheric and Oceanographic Organization, to measure salinity and ocean currents in areas where nobody else can go. And that's also super exciting, because we need to know how the ocean currents go in the Drake Passage or in the Gulf Stream in depths down to 1,000 meters, and we need to monitor that. And animals do that for us. Elephant seals do that. And that makes them so important for humans that we want to preserve them, not only for their beauty and their, for everything else, but also for the fact that they provide data that nobody else can provide.
Yeah, let's double down on that a little bit, because there are obviously different implications of your research. And there are some more creative ideas around sort of financial and systemic solutions. But if we're just looking at conservation, you say in one of your papers that the best examples of the potential of the Internet of Animals comes from systems designed to protect migrating animals. You spoke about the Birdcast project and the Whale Safe project. I'd love for you to describe those. One, just very quickly, one that that one idea that stuck with me that I'm not sure if they're implementing yet. They kind of are for migration, but it's more of the Whale Safe. It's the idea of mobile protected areas, right? So as animals actually don't, protected areas might not have to be these like stationary lands anymore because of what's happening to our planet and humans moving. So, but I'd be curious about the Birdcast and the Whale Safe project. What are those?
Well, the whale safe, I think, is the best developed and the most forward looking. So it's northern right whales in northeastern Canada, small population but recovering, but they have a lot of interaction with human activities, boat traffic or people in the ocean. And they implemented a system that wherever those whales show up, boats have to slow down, they have to avoid certain areas. So it's really like the whales have this nature preserve around them that we sort of allocate space around these whales wherever they are to their safety. And I think that's a fantastic system because it really allows us to, first of all, understand what these whales are, where they are, what they're doing, really bring the biology, the life history of these whales to people, but then also really to protect them dynamically wherever they are. And I think that is one of the really important models, as you said, for the future, for shorebirds, for example, that are constrained by a lot of the shore developments. The good thing is during COVID, these shores were closed down. Nobody were allowed to go there. And now we know, this is possible. You can close a beach down for 2 days and say if there's a huge group of shorebirds landing in a beach in Mallorca or in France, and they need a day to feed up, to really sort of rest and forage, then you can say, well, guys, sorry, this Saturday the beach is closed, the birds have landed, they need a day. Sunday morning you can go back to the beach, and that should be okay. People are used to that now. Sure, there will initially be some rumbling, but this is how we live together, and we should be happy, and we can stand next to the beach and observe the animals for a day, or go somewhere else, and then everybody is happy at the end.
Yeah, I mean, we have to share our land. It's a bit like, I've lived in Mexico for a long time, and like the amount of times I was in the airport and like we had to everything was shut down because some presidential plane was taking off or arriving. It's like,
yes,
and like the presidents come out. It's like we can shut down our airports for like international fleets, so we can shut down our beaches for international fleets of creatures. And then, I think it's a bit the same with bird safe, right? It's like, when we know that these large flocks of birds are migrating, we can turn off our city lights because the city lights probably disturb them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's really important also for windcraft, windmills, for example. There are systems now that can measure over long distances if a kite is approaching that is potentially in danger of collision with a windmill, and then they are slowed down for that amount of time, and then they run again if there's no animal around that is in danger. So I think those kind of systems will become much more prevalent. And I think you only need them initially to really teach animals. A kite or a raptor that knows once that a windmill is dangerous is okay. I mean, they learn quickly. That's what they do. That's what they're made for. But you have to give them the chance to learn before killing them.
It's quite a sentence. And in the and in the case of the conservation community, so you've spoken about alerting people to poachers, and in some of your work you speak about like these highly endangered African wild dogs, and we can tell when they've been snared. How would you imagine some of this technology interfacing with the existing networks of like, let's say like landscape trackers or local communities or sort of like livelihoods? Because we obviously don't want to replace those jobs. We want more people to be in the
Mm-hmm.
land tracking. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do you imagine that the tech interfaces with sort of hopefully bringing more humans into landscapes to do this kind of work as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we see that already in Kruger or in areas where we allow access to the information of animals, because then people go out and they really see animals. They can really, they also know the history of, say, that group of wild dogs, and then they can go out and observe them, and oh, this is, they are named at some point. This is that animal, and they are together, and they like each other. They don't like each other. This one comes from this other group, and I think it makes the experience much richer because you can relate to what's really happening there. It's almost like having your own animals at home, which are part of the family, and then the wild animals can be almost, to some extent at least, part of the family. You know them, you know of them, you know their life history, and I think that makes it much more exciting for people.
And I guess you're not, I mean, a potential criticism is that you're supplanting like local or replacing like local knowledge, right? Like if we're outsourcing our knowledge of these creatures to technology, what's the role of the wildlife tracker
Mm-hmm.
in actually being able to read the animals? So
Mm-hmm.
how I'm sure you've had many conversations with trackers, and how is it that it kind of adds and creates more of a shared body than replaces
Mm-hmm.
people?
That's actually a really good point, and we have made some basically a digital museum for that kind of knowledge. So it's called the Movebank Museum, MOMU. Uh, it gives animals a unique identifier, and that's a universally unique identifier. It's a UUID that each animal can get assigned or can sort of get through their markings or their tags. But it also means that people that are out there can write things down. For example, somebody in Niger, in the Niger Delta, told us, well, we always observe that the animals, certain weaver birds, they build their nests in different altitudes in trees. And that is actually the lowest level of where the flooding will be at the end of the season. And they wanted to know whether that's a real thing or whether that they're, but this is a local cultural knowledge. And this is something that can be written down along with the life history of these animals. And then you can go through and say, well, it's basically a repository for traditional knowledge about animals or about nature, but especially about animals in certain areas. So I think we're not only giving animals a voice, but we're also giving the interpreters, the traditional interpreters of animals, a voice. That means you can put your information into an eternal digital collection that is linked to animals, but it is there. It can be tested. It can be used by others that are interested in that, and we still know about it in 500 years.
It's making me think of quite like a geeky thing, which is like the interoperability between all these systems. Like when I was living in British Columbia, I interfaced with this group called Trailmark Systems, and it's sort of like, of them, yeah. So they sort of, they have a software that allows local communities not just to record their land tenure, but their songs and stories and like sacred natural sites. And there's analogous groups doing this, like Digital Democracy and in other parts of the global South, but like this overlay of tools that allow local communities to tell the story of their land, then combining that with the animal information, then combining that with some of the like bioacoustic information and the interspecies translation efforts that are underway right now, like Earth Species Project and others. And for example, like what Dan Hammer is working on, he was on earlier in the show talking about some of the foundation models that they're building for the Earth, like a Google kind of ChatGPT-3 for the Earth, where you can query the Earth. I'm really curious, like how all of those things might be coming together and how they can be interoperable and so kind of feed into each other. Are all of you guys in conversation with each other?
Starting to be, and I think you hit the nail exactly. I mean, this is the key component that sort of we see as the outcome of the Internet of Animals, but it has to interface with all the other information systems. And it is a huge challenge, but we are starting to talk. And there are, for example, foundations like the Moore Foundation who is supporting that on an international level. There will be a tag for wildlife, a Tech for Wildlife conference next year, also initiated by this Moore Foundation initiative, the Wild Labs. So I think that is something where we're finally living up to this challenge of having a global information system on nature, on animals, but it has to be brought together. Also with the traditional systems like the regular Earth observations from satellites, or so the greenness measurement satellites, or all of those systems that we have already, which are really good, but they are not sufficient.
Yeah. And then obviously the question is like how that influences political and financial systems. And so something, you know, that I've been working with in the Crowther Lab, or, you know, different measurement systems for biodiversity, and what people in the space called MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, verification. And you wrote this in something I was reading, which is, you know, ICARUS's live sensing networks are well placed to provide an ecological ground truth, bringing the insights of animals to bear, for instance, on the risk models of banks and reinsurers. So can you talk a little bit about like how everything we're speaking about right now can apply not just for conservation, but things like the financial industry? You know, how could they influence the risk model of a bank or a reinsurer?
Yeah, well, I think that's influenced by discussions with Jonathan Ledgert and the interspecies groups that I think are really pioneering this area. That you could say animal information can be verified, and if they do something that is of value to humans and can be put to value, then
which is kind of everything they do, because they're just keeping the world alive.
Exactly, but you can transfer it into dollars or euros or yens for the financial sector. I mean, we are not good at that, but I mean, there are groups that are really good at that, and I think what we can do is verify and sort of transmit what animals feel and see, and others can put that into value and global credits, biodiversity credits, or natural carbon credits. So I think those kind of things are also developing, and we are not the best to do that. We are just sort of on the animal side, but I think that's really important to close the entire system to make it a self-sustained and, well, a system that is also really appreciated by the global public.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said that, and I'm sure you share this sentiment with me. It's like, oh, what can the animals do for us that we can factor into our systems? And I'm really excited about a future world where it's like, well, what are we doing for the animals that creates value for them? And like, you know, it's like the world is so topsy-turvy. I mean, the interspecies money, Jonathan Lagarde project, or, you know, animals having a wallet, is quite interesting. And I think that um, why it can happen now versus why it couldn't happen in the past, let's say with the technologies that you're building, it's right, if I'm correct, it's because now individual animals can really be tracked and traced. And so maybe you can share an example of how this could work, right? Like, how could an animal have a wallet that then a human custodian looks after? Like, what is the financial mechanism behind that, and the part that ICARUS could offer into that kind of system?
Yeah. Well, we're starting actually to do that with the community in northeastern Namibia, where they have community land and they also have wild animals roaming around there, let's say giraffes. And then they are, in a way, the guardian of those giraffes because they keep their land healthy enough that the giraffes can survive. But they are not, they don't get any compensation for that. People go there and want to see these animals, but there's very little that remains with the communities. And that is something we would like to help, so that the giraffes tell us every 10 minutes if they are healthy, if they are okay, if everything is good, and if by the end of the day they, we know throughout the day they have had a good time, they had whatever, some predator came around, so they were stressed a little bit, but the rest, they were doing fine. Then the local people can get a payout for their actions towards keeping biodiversity on the planet healthy. But I think that's important that we have a real time system of reporting, or allowing the animals to report their own health and safety. And if they do that, then that's a good sign and a good payout for people.
I think something in that example also points to one of the things that keeps me up at night, which is like, so many people want to be involved in quote unquote this movement, whatever this movement is. It's 1,000 different ways of approaching it. And especially I think younger people want to really get involved. My sense is that this field that you're working in, which is this intersection of so many different, it's kind of the intersection of many different fields. I feel like it could create a lot of meaningful work for people that are seeking to sort of be supportive to nature, right? And so I'm curious, as you have an interesting vantage point over the sector, like what are the interesting like companies or startups that you can see emerging, from all this? And, if there was like a young human alive today listening to this, or a conservationist, or someone who doesn't even necessarily, hasn't studied ecology, like I did study ecology in school at least, like what are the potential things you could see happening in this field that could really just kind of blossom out like new types of applications?
Yeah. Well, I think for one, the real-time data evaluation, so for the sort of analytical computer geeks, that is very important. And we have systems where we bring programmers and ecologists together, so that the programmers, can be a banker, can be an insurance person, whatever it is, can write code that helps the biologists to sort of link to the animals and run analysis in real time, because that's super important. So there are some companies developing, and then probably the most important is in this in this interspecies communication and financial sector. There are some startups, biodiversity credit startups, and so on, that link all this information together. And I think that is something where probably a lot of future development lies, and there's enormous potential for young people to get involved.
Yeah, and I wonder also, if you wrote in your book about like how we could use existing human infrastructure to become like a sensor network for nature. In this concept of edge computing, you said, right, imagine if even a fraction of the 85 plus million personal security cameras in the USA could sign up to share data with the animal monitoring programs, or like these smart cars. What's that about? Because I'm sure that even people who are working on like consumer products, for lack of a better word, could be like thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean the cameras at the houses, they observe their environment all the time, and you could use that information even anonymously to monitor what's happening in an environment, how good biodiversity is doing. The cars are such high-tech units these days that they even have radar scanning systems where insects are blocked out, but we could use the information about the insects to monitor insects across the roads of this planet, which are all over the place. So those kind of things could be very exciting. And I think there's also, for, I would say, non-traditional fields, like a car engineer, an automotive engineer could develop something as a sustainability project for one of the big car companies to say, we're doing that, we're offering those data, or we're even preparing those data for biodiversity credits, so that cars can monitor where the best insect diversity is in certain areas, and that is then being remunerated in some way. So I think just interesting non-traditional ways of um, interacting humans and nature, I think is probably where a lot of the action can lie in the near future.
Yeah, it's actually reminding me of an episode that we did connecting landscapes and like wildlife corridors and wildlife
Hmm.
bridges, and like
Hmm.
urban designers who are thinking about places for the animals to roost, and they're doing beautiful projects of that in the US. One sort of closing thought or comment, Martin. Like your love of nature and how much you deeply care is like it's so evident, and I think one of the coolest things I've come across when I was reading your work. You speak about like the parliament. What do you call it? The parliament of animals. And I really like this concept of like imaginary futures, which is something that we're looking at in our work. And it's how do we create just speculative examples of like what a future would be? And so, in your book, you spoke. I really love this idea of a life cast of the planet every day. It's really cool. I'm going to read it out because basically, you're speaking about like, you're like sitting in your whatever home and there's a report. So is it okay? I'm going to read like one or two things from this live cast because I think
Sure.
it's also a great way to end, which is like, yeah, imagine that in 15 years or 10 years or whatever the timeline is, five, we're living in a world where like you're waking up to this stuff. And like, I love that you've included this in your work because if we can't imagine it, it's harder for it to happen. And so, you know, one LifeCast report would say things like, and I'm reading from your book, white storks and black kites, which are birds, have discovered another major outbreak of desert locusts in southwestern Chad. Griffons in the central Himalayas are warning of an incoming storm, so Everest expeditions should remain at base camp. And there's good news from the seabirds. Um, in Polynesia and around the Pacific Rim are indicating that this year will not be an El Nino year, as resources in the ocean appear to be excellent for breeding. Then you have example reports in the disease realm, like some fruit bats that are migrating, have remained in the forests, and the sensors indicate they probably have high levels of antibodies. So it's just this awesome sort of speculation of like how it could actually be to daily have people immersed in the life worlds of these beings. And then there's a beautiful moment when you imagine that like our children could tune into devices to catch up on the latest news from these global ambassadors and on the animals they've signed up to protect remotely, right? So this is also the application.
Mhm.
So I just think that this is so cool in terms of like what's the future that we could live inside of.
And it's happening already. And when we have Facebook groups in France that are quicker to observe our tagged storks than we are. They are out there as soon as they realize there's a problem. They are out there helping the storks, and that's
Yeah.
exciting to see. It's we didn't initiate that. They found that they created their own life support for animals.
So how can people who are listening create their own life support networks based upon some of the things you're doing? Like, what would be the process for people to engage?
Or you could adopt animals. I mean, for example, in from here in Namibia, or local animals like storks, or deer even, and then be the guardian of those animals. You know what they are doing. You know where they are. You can help them, but also help create a safe environment for many animals by using these large ambassador species that we now have. It could be a lynx, it could be a wolf, a bear, a deer, a stork, a heron, whatever it is. I think just people relating to animals, it's a nice way to do that.
How do you adopt an animal? Like, are you speaking, like, is there an actual way that people can do that?
Well, we're about to set up a system where people can have a little tag on an animal, and they can either go out with people to do that,
I love it.
or or then sort of buy into the system. And we tried that a few years ago, but then the tracking tags were so expensive that nobody could afford that. They were like 1,500 euros. but now they are 50 euros or 100. And that means, it's affordable. People can really do that. They can have their individual animal linked to them, and get live feeds all the time. So that makes it really attractive.
I love that. Is that something that will be ready soon and I can like share it in the show notes or something?
We could have, we're thinking about doing it in earnest next year. But as a test case, we could do it also now. So that is possible. Yeah.
I mean, I from everything I've read, I can't imagine you saying that something isn't possible. So I'm not surprised by your answer, but we can talk about that. Martin, and also all the people who you work with, right? Because you're obviously, you've got teams. And so thank you to you and your teams and to all of this beautiful and such dignified work that you're doing. It's, yeah, the earth is better for you being in it. And so
Well,
just, thank you so much. And thank you for
thanks a
coming
lot.
and sharing on the show.
Thanks for your interest. It's great talking to you.
Yeah.